So why don't we start? Good. Welcome. I'm John Henry, Chairman of the Committee for the Republic. Tonight is a very special occasion for a very special person. We're here to honor and celebrate Chas Freeman, quintessential patriot and the gold standard of American diplomacy. I'm equally blessed to have him as a good friend who loves to share a good joke. Vast eclectic knowledge and skills have given Chas a rare ability to observe a moment in history, connect seemingly invisible dots, and articulate a clear way forward, which represents the best in us. He's one of a kind. America has been his family home for 4 centuries, and he proudly traces his ancestors back to Charlemagne and Noah's great-granddaughter. His American forebears enthusiastically backed the oppositional breakaway state of Rhode Island, took anti-federalism to new heights, and established a family tradition of marching to their own drummer and doing things differently. The list of Chas' unique abilities is endless. His capacity to see the big picture is uncommonly matched by his seemingly inexhaustible attention to detail. His fluency in more than a dozen languages is legendary. His mastery of 11,000 Chinese characters made him a highly effective translator for Nixon's opening to China. He learned Arabic upon being appointed American ambassador in Riyadh. No one is quicker on his feet. Without advance notice, Chas can instantly make highly intelligent and cogent arguments. By the same token, I've seen him reverse or alter his position on the spot when presented with new facts and arguments. No Secretary of State has the imagination, eloquence, industry, ability, wisdom, and judgment of Chas. But history is often unkind and almost always suboptimal. His nuanced and wise approach ran counter to the grain of America's militarized, Wilsonian, Old Testament foreign policy of good guys and bad guys. He was a chosen person for an American public that no longer exists. When George W. Bush waged a war of aggression against Iraq, it violated the America Chas loved. My wife returned from a Council on Foreign Relations meeting telling me about a former ambassador to Saudi Arabia saying the United States had an enemy deficit disorder. Bill Nitze, Boyd and Gray, and I met Chas at the Cosmos Club for lunch. We were all alarmed about going abroad in search of monsters to destroy. His speaking truth to power galvanized us. At the end of the lunch, we decided to found the Committee for the Republic. Chas has been the committee's 5-star ambassador. We focus on subjects where there is no gridlock between the 2 major political parties. History's largest empire is politically invisible in the United States. Democrats and Republicans subvert the Constitution by pretending our empire doesn't exist. The committee took up the mantle under his leadership and gave American citizens the debate we need and so richly deserve. Sporting his constitutional personality and exercising his citizen identity, Chas embodies the principles of the founders of the American Constitutional Republic. For Chas, his lucidity and balance in argument is unsurpassed. For Chas, constitutional means must supersede policy ends. For Chas, separation of powers is the heartbeat of a constitutional republic. For Chas, expanding executive primacy and congressional abdication and presidential usurpation of the war power is a betrayal of the American Revolution and the American War of Independence. I promise not to give Chas too many compliments, So he now appears sufficiently embarrassed, so I'll stop. I'd like to hand it over to Boyden, our other co-founder, Boyden Gray.
Well, there's little I can say to add to what Chas is, what John's already said, but I do want to make a couple points. The main one being that Chas is the most gentle and genial genius I've ever met or read about. And his field of foreign policy, which he covered 380 degrees, he never made me or the others feel ignorant or untutored or even stupid. He was a gracious teacher. He was a funny teacher. He has an extraordinary sense of humor. And working with him was always an incredible joy. He understood and saw the link between big government abroad and too much government at home. And I think really has advanced the ball on those two fronts. It's now beginning to show up with little green shoots in various pockets of the Congress. So I just want to thank you, Chas, for a great association over these many years. I've treasured every minute with you, your humor, your incisiveness, your knowledge, and your incredible generosity of spirit. So thanks again, Chas.
Thank you, Boyden. So Chas, let's move to you, and then we'll come back and give you the award. So why don't we turn it over to you at this point? Everybody wants to hear from you.
I was actually pretty much struck dumb by and speechless by those remarkably generous and quite excessive remarks. I thank you very much. A few of us get to hear ourselves eulogized while we're still alive, and I thank you, John Henry and Boyden Gray, and the Committee for the Republic for this rare privilege. Reports of my advancing decrepitude are not greatly exaggerated. We all die slowly and then suddenly, and that finally silences us. But I have no intention of shutting up anytime soon. In addition to being with John Boyden and the late Bill Nitze, one of the founders of the committee, I am the organizer and still the principal contributor to its listserv. Let me take this opportunity to thank Max Moore for his congenial management of the self-regulated salon list, and thank many, many others for your frequent suggestions of items of interest. You know who you are, and I'm in your debt, and so are we all. I post a lot of stuff I don't agree with because I hope others will find it as stimulating as I do. I expect that those on the list can form their own judgments without having to hear mine. No one is obliged to consider opinions other than those they find congenial, but no one who does not listen to and consider other opinions is entitled to claim that their own are balanced, rational, or justified. As the committee has hoped, many pointed exchanges do take place off list among its members. It's in this context that I am deeply honored that the committee has chosen to include me among the whistleblowers and truth tellers on whom it has previously bestowed its Defender of Liberty Awards. The award is recognition that dissent can be the highest form of patriotism. I grew up in the British colony of the Bahamas. I was at home there. I could have become Bahamian or British. Instead, I chose to reaffirm my identity as an American. My family, as John mentioned, has been in this country for 4 centuries, but I came back to it with all the wondering delight of a new immigrant. America's pretensions to be an idea rather than a country are inspiring, but its racial and ethnic diversity are, for me, a visual and cultural delight. As Herman Melville put it, to spill American blood is to spill the blood of the whole world. we Americans can make an honest claim to have aspired and striven to reduce the many gaps between our ideals and our practices in the 245 years since we proclaimed our independence. Our Republic's Declaration of Independence, its Constitution, and its Bill of Rights require us to do so. These documents constitute the greatest artifact of political engineering the world has yet known. The Constitution we adopted 234 years ago carefully balances opportunities for individual self-fulfillment with constitutionally constrained governance. As I rediscovered my homeland, like Jean de Crèvecoeur, I fell in love with it. To love someone or something is to put her well-being and happiness above your own. I sought fulfillment in serving our republic and its people. I did so as a diplomat for 30 years. I never doubted that the personal and financial sacrifices this entailed were worthwhile. There is an American cult of the warrior. Nobody fetishizes diplomats. But at our best, we are both dedicated advocates for our nation's interests and professional problem solvers with a firm eye on the need to sustain an international environment that bolsters the security and prosperity of our country. Like the military, our professional standards require us to respect the dictates of the government the American people have elected and to implement constitutionally authorized policies while setting our personal opinions aside. Also, like the military, this sometimes involves putting our lives on the line in ways that folks back home can hardly imagine. In my 30 years of public service, I worked in India, Taiwan, mainland China, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Europe. I was fortunate to see a lot of history-changing events up close. I was even able to leave a beneficial mark or two on the last century in the first part of this one. That was gratifying. But I confess that learning from my mistakes, having the chance each day to be a better person and a more effective advocate for my country's interests than I was the day before, and a second marriage with a wise and caring woman of character is what explains my current happiness. I retired from public service nearly 3 decades ago. But even as I have belatedly pursued my own well-being, I have remained greatly concerned for our republics. The Committee for the Republic came together as our country prepared to invade Iraq for no real reason other than that we could, and then stayed in Iraq mostly to avoid acknowledging our failures there. American militarism, the fiendish offspring of our 4-decade-long Cold War, had grown to maturity. 9/11 gave it the opportunity to strut its stuff before new enemies. The committee's founders feared that such bellicosity would erode our republic's constitutional traditions and the civil liberties. Sadly, these fears proved well-founded. The committee sought to stimulate reflection about the need to reimpose the checks and balances the founders designed to make the use of force the last rather than the first tool of American statecraft. Nearly 2 decades later, it's good finally to see the beginnings of a debate about this, as Boyden mentioned. But it may be too late. Benjamin Franklin's often quoted doubts about whether we Americans could keep our republic may have been prescient. The world has seen republics lose their rectitude and decline before. The Roman Republic became addicted to empire, gave up its citizen army in favor of praetorians and mercenaries, hollowed out the institutions of its representative government, and pretended to sustain a constitutional separation of powers while enthroning Caesarism. Rome's famous devotion to the rule of law gave way to Ovid's view that, quote, the result justifies the deed, unquote. Undisguised venality replaced republican virtue. cynical resignation to odious practices succeeded aspirations for good government, and expediency displaced principle as the basis for policy decisions. So much for constitutional democracy and due process. I doubt I am the only one to detect something similar in progress here. I am not a fan of mechanistic theories about historical cycles, but I can't help remembering the lessons some have drawn from the rise and fall of dynastic or constitutional orders in China over the past 2 millennia. These orders appear to last for somewhere between 225 and 250 years, at which point they are so embarnacled by hubris and complacency, bureaucratism, corruption, and elite denial of unpalatable realities that they lose legitimacy. One of three things then happens. The people topple the regime and install a new one. The governing system renews itself in time to start a second constitutional cycle, or the nation and its political culture are overpowered by foreign enemies. It has occurred to me that we are coming up on the 250th year of our Constitution and the Republic it created. Just saying. American decadence is amplified and buttressed by technological developments and their impact on popular morality. We now lack a consensus about the past as well as the present and future. We are flagellating and dividing ourselves over past sins. We are making more than our fair share of mistakes and squandering the tremendous advantages nature and history have bestowed on our country. I've spoken about these issues elsewhere, and I will refrain from doing so tonight, except in response to specific questions and comments about current trends and events. I hope there are many of these. As a nation, we have made an apparent decision to confront and compete with a rising China and resurgent Russia, and to do so by rallying an international coterie behind us. But in our current condition, we are not fit to compete with either of these great powers successfully, and ever fewer of our international partners think it prudent to link their fate to ours. We have an executive that rules by executive fiat when it rules at all, and that intervenes abroad without constitutional constraint. We have a legislature that rubber stamps defense spending, but can't pass laws, approve treaties, consider and confirm policymaking officials, or balance budgets, still less check the executive. And we have a judiciary appointed for its partisanship rather than its impartiality. It's not clear that our failing democracy can safely transit another national election. We seem to be dissolving all the invisible bonds that have unified Americans in a shared national enterprise. These incapacities and doubts were made in America. They can only be cured by Americans. The Committee for the Republic remains a vital forum in which to consider how to craft a better future for the United States of America. I am proud to have played a role in creating it and sustaining it. It's needed now more than ever. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Chas. Extremely eloquent as always. Max, can we show the Defender of Liberty Award now to Chas? Did we lose Max?
No, I'm here. I'm going to say a few words just so the camera focuses on me for a while.
Great. Thanks.
Okay, so we can read that. It said, Max, can you read the inscription there?
Chas Freeman,
It says,
Defender of
courage
Liberty
is the,
Award.
is
Courage is the first virtue, making all other virtues possible.
So Chad, I don't think anyone represents that better than you. And as I said earlier in our remarks, it was your courage in speaking truth to power that galvanized us into forming the committee. And you've been amazing at every step and turn, and we look forward to continuing as long as we can. So this is a new lease on life, and we wanted at this time to give you the Defender of Liberty Award. And I'm just thrilled that I'm thrilled about tonight. Thrilled about who you are and how inspiring you've been to all of us.
That is very, very kind, and I deeply appreciate it. I don't know if I can, my New England modesty may cause me to suffocate under all the.
Well, I
flattery.
I promised you I wouldn't embarrass you too much. So I see Bruce Fine is our vice chairman is checking in 90-degree weather and from
For midnight.
Nigeria. It's after midnight. Was it 1 o'clock there, Bruce?
About 1 o'clock, yes.
Oh boy.
But it was worth staying up, Chaz. That was absolutely brilliant speech. If I can take a couple of few words, even though it's hard to compliment the legend, which you are, Chaz. I would say, to borrow from Shakespeare, the elements are so mixed in you that nature might stand up and say to all the world, this is a man. It really is a treat just to listen to the measured words and insights that you have. The question that I would, I'll say this as well, although I know you're going to live a long time, that when it comes that you pass, the earth will lose a bright light, but a star will be lit in heaven. And I guess that's some solace for everyone here, who's enjoyed so much your companionship and wisdom. I did want, however, maybe to open the question with a quote from Tacitus, one of the few that you bypassed, when he said about the collapse of the Roman Republic, the worst crimes were dared by few, willed by more, and tolerated by all. Do you see that phenomenon now vexing the United States?
Well, that's a justified insult to our political class, I think. It is rare these days to see anyone stand on principle. And we have seen numerous examples of people who prefer to grandstand rather than address facts. So I'm afraid that quote from Tacitus, you might also have quoted his other famous saying that, we made a desert and called it peace.
Yeah.
But I'm afraid that is very apt in the current circumstances. The American people, I note that Steve Bannon has just been declared to be in contempt of Congress by a committee and perhaps by the whole House. But in fact, the Congress, for precisely the reason that Tacitus so succinctly said, has earned the contempt of most of the American people. And it needs to stand up and be counted. There is, at the present time, before the House, a bill which would authorize the President of the United States to go to war with China over Taiwan's self-determination. That is, first of all, unconstitutional. The Congress cannot delegate the war power in that manner. Second, it is a cop-out. It is an effort by politicians on the Hill to avoid accountability and responsibility for starting a war that the United States, by all accounts, would most likely lose, and that could well end in a nuclear exchange. This is the kind of irresponsibility that is tolerated, not objected to, and that is endangering our republic, which is still salvageable, but only with hard work and a return to principle.
Thank you, Chaz. Okay, we've got a lot of people here. I see Doug McGregor. You've been a big fan of Chaz over the years. Doug, would you like to say something?
Well, there's part of me that wants to say that had Chaz been British
I thought for a moment, Doug, you were going to suggest that I was in every way comparable to Boris Johnson. But I'm glad you didn't.
I was thinking more in terms of Palmerston.
Oh, thank you. That is indeed a
Good. So we have a close friend. Close, do you want to? Close, go ahead.
First of all, let me just declare my wholehearted assent to all of the kudos that have been passed your way. I have rarely met a person of such a combination of talents, and I won't repeat what they are. It's just amazing that so much could have come together in a single individual. A question I have has to do with what you see happening within the American constitutional regime. You have indicated broad problems. Now, I'd like to take up one issue that has been much on my mind in recent months, and that is that the Committee for the Republic has devoted a great deal of time to the war powers, how authority has been abdicated by the Congress, and that the executive has greedily absorbed whatever has been abdicated. I wanted to express a concern that I would very much appreciate hearing your own views of, and that is that so troublesome is the state of the United States at this time that it would almost appear that defending constitutional government with regard to foreign policy has to take a back seat to fighting for traditional American liberties. We see, it seems to me, a wholesale assault, an almost totalitarian mentality, which amounts to a curtailment of the freedom to associate. Enemies are declared criminals. I find a spreading sense of insecurity among the people, as you wonder if one day the FBI will come for somebody who has dared to express a view that dissents from that of the political establishment. So I won't belabor the point, but it seems to me that we're dealing with a broadside of attacks on traditional American liberties, and that we may have to develop a partly different approach than the one that we have emphasized in order to counter this threat. Of course, we have to continue our fight for constitutional restrictions on the executive. But what about the more general developments that threaten American liberties?
I don't see a contradiction at all between a respectable civil debate on foreign policy issues, which we badly need, and fixing our problems at home. I don't think if we don't fix our problems at home, we are not going to be effective in foreign policy. That's a basic premise that I have. I think a good deal of this is a personal opinion that the FBI will not turn up on your door, Klaus. They won't need to because a Twitter mob will be organized online, and you will be burned at the stake, figuratively, I hope, not literally, by a lynch mob that is organized on social media. And my concern in this regard is twofold, maybe threefold. First, I think much of the Bill of Rights has been suspended in practice, and that is extremely damaging to American liberties. Second, the social atmosphere is one in which, as I said, there is no consensus anymore about the past, the present, or the future. We disagree. And why is that? It is because our information universe is dominated by corporate oligopolies, which have a business plan that depends on discovering your prejudices using big data and artificial intelligence analysis, and connecting you first in a group with others of similar predilections, pandering to your prejudice as a group in order to sell advertising. So this is a mechanism, a business plan, which depends on dividing Americans into sub-communities of common prejudice. And it is a perfect petri dish for the hatching of conspiracy theories. And these sub-communities basically neither communicate with each other nor give any credence to what each other are saying. And so the basic trust that must be the root of any national society has been severely eroded. And I would add that these corporate oligopolies now function as censors, although no one elected them. They determine who will be allowed to use their means of communication and who won't, with no subject, no process of subjecting these decisions to any kind of due process. So we have a situation in which the government's functions are being usurped, perhaps not only within the separation of powers, but by the corporate sector, and in which the corporate sector is doing its best to slice, dice, and sort us into antagonistic groups. And this leads to the final observation. No nation can remain united without a deference to common myths and common heroes. Our myths are being destroyed, deconstructed, if you will. Our heroes are being toppled from their pedestals. This is not a recipe for division, not unity. So I think one of the things we have to grapple with, and I note that we're not the only one trying to deal with these new technological realities. They're trying to do this in China, of all places, and in Europe, and we need to find a way to restore civility, respect for divergent opinion, and common access to common facts, as opposed to immersion in only alternative facts.
Good. So, Molly,
Yes.
there you are. You're
I'm
unmuted.
here.
Go ahead.
I would like to say two things. One, I'm so pleased that this award is being given to Chas, who I admire so much. And the one thing that John didn't mention that I think for me describes something that's so special about him is the way in which he not only gives us clarity, but he does it in the form of poetry, because I really hear the quality of poetry in the way he expresses himself. Thank you for that. And then I have a question. If someone were to give you the power to grant you 3 wishes, what 3 steps would you take to clean up the mess we're in?
Well,
Oh
of
my
course,
God.
Molly, that's very high praise indeed from a great journalist, and I thank you for that. Of course, the classic answer to the 3 questions dilemma is the one that the Polish fisherman gave when he fished a bottle out of the river and opened it to find a genie coming out and granting him 3 wishes. And as you will recall, his first wish was that the Chinese army would invade Poland. And the genie was somewhat perplexed by this, but he agreed. And sure enough, a Chinese army came into Poland, occupied it for a while, and then went back. So the genie asked the Polish fisherman, "What's your second wish?" And he said, "I wanted a Chinese army to invade Poland." And the genie said, "We already did that." He said, "No, I want it done again." So the Chinese army invaded Poland and occupied it and was there for a while and then went home. And finally, the genie said to the fisherman, don't tell me your third wish is you want a Chinese army to invade Poland." He said, "Yeah, that's right. I really do." And so the Chinese army came and occupied Poland and went back. And the genie said, "Now, may I ask you a question? Why did you want the Chinese army to invade Poland 3 times?" He said, the fisherman said, "To do that, they had to cross Russia 6 times." So I don't know what the answer to your question is. I don't think I'm going to find a genie in the Narragansett Bay where I am, in a bottle or anywhere else. And I suppose my first wish would be that people actually read the Constitution, take some effort to understand it. Second, that Facebook be demolished, and social media be regulated as a public utility, which I think they must be. And third, that Americans rediscover the spirit of tolerance that is essential in any democracy, and which we have lost.
Excellent. Good. So, who do we have? Clyde, I see you're there. Why don't we talk, since one of the things we do every year is we talk about China, and we have vigorous debates about what we ought to do about China. I think we all agree we should stay out of a war with China. The difference is more center around how realistic it is to retrade. How would one go about retrading the economics of the relationship? But Chas did a brilliant salon on the Taiwan question, which I think we probably ought to go into. But Clyde, why don't you get us into the China topic?
So I first met Chas in the fall of 1982 when I was on the first U.S. trade mission to China. And, those were the days before China had really begun to grow economically. And I think we had about 300 businessmen with us to try to establish initial business contacts and get trade going. And apparently it worked because now we have so much trade that we're beginning to think we don't need it as much. But what's interesting to me particularly is that China itself, and particularly in the last several years under Xi Jinping, has, here in the U.S. we've been talking about decoupling, and Trump took steps to decouple, and Biden is, I'm not quite sure where Biden is, but he's not moving away from Trump policy. So I assume he's on essentially the same wavelength. But China itself is taking steps to decouple, and talking about dual circulation and assuring, trying to reduce its dependence on outside sources. So I'm really curious as to where Chas sees, not U.S. policy so much, but where Chas sees China economic and trade policy going.
China, I think, has responded to the decoupling effort here, which is driven by national security concerns, and the tariff war, which was driven by a combination of ideology national security concerns about trade imbalances, bilateral trade imbalances at that. Economists who didn't think that Ricardo knew what he was talking about in 1817 played a big role in this. So China's responding, and it is responding by trying to remove its vulnerabilities, which have been amply demonstrated with American assaults on companies like Huawei, by developing supply chains for key sectors that are mostly within China or in countries that are unlikely to do what the United States has done, launch a trade war. I think at the moment, what Xi Jinping is doing is misportrayed for the most part in the U.S. Media. There are large parallels with Teddy Roosevelt's response to the end of the Gilded Age. First, vigorous enforcement of antitrust policy to prevent the subversion of national political power by plutocracies and so on. Of course, this is just as popular with Wall Street as Teddy Roosevelt's policies to break up the Standard Oil Company were with Mr. Rockefeller. That's one thing. Second is an effort to solve the dilemmas that I mentioned that arise from technology and social media oligopolies. And there, I think the jury's out. And I don't think the Chinese necessarily have an effective answer. Whatever the answer is, it involves state censorship on some level, which is odious in my view. But we, at least the Chinese, are doing something about restoring some measure of the veracity to public communication. I think that while this is going on, interestingly, China's opening up its capital markets still more to the delight of the Goldman Sachs's and others on Wall Street. And what is really relevant is that there's a big disconnect between the American corporate and business community now and the national security establishment, with the corporate community very much wanting to leverage Chinese prosperity to its own benefit and that presumably of its shareholders. I think Mr. Biden, I have no idea what Mr. Biden thinks about China. I'm not sure that he has a view of any coherence. But I think it is politically expedient for him to continue the Trump policies because this gives him a certain measure of protection against the predictable slanderous attacks from the China hawks in the Republican Party and progressives in the Democratic Party who obsess over their view of the human rights circumstances in China. So the course of least resistance to the Trump policies is the course that is most politically expedient in a period when Mr. Biden's trying to get basic legislation passed on a wide variety of subjects where he needs at least to temper, if not to temper Republican opposition and progressive opposition, even if he can't seduce it into adopting his positions. So I think, everybody for the last 40 years, Clyde, when we met in 1982, no one really knew where China was going. I recall immodestly an incident which I'll just relate. In 1979, after Mao died, I was in Beijing. I was the country director for China at the Department of State, a position that then had considerably more authority than it does now. And it was the weekend. I was staying at the Beijing Hotel, which was the only hotel worthy of the name in Beijing. And I walked out toward Tiananmen Square, and this is on a Saturday, and I came across a guy with a push cart selling noodle soup. I love noodle soup. But if you knew anything about China, you would know that for 20 years, there had been no such people on the street, no vendors of any kind. People ate in cafeterias. They had collective facilities. Here was this guy on the street selling noodle soup. So I asked him, in Chinese. I said, well, what commune do you belong to? What group are you with? He said, I'm my own group. I'm my own group. And I thought, wow, something really big is happening. I went back to Washington. I started to make this argument. And then in February 1980, there was an all China Watcher meeting at the Smithsonian Castle. And I was the only person there. There were 50 people attending from CIA, NSA, DIA, the State Department, virtually every agency in town, and JCS. And I was the only person there who thought there was a revolution going on in China, started by Deng Xiaoping. Everybody else said, oh no, this is all flim flam. China's never going to do the things that you're saying. And I was so upset that I got on my motorcycle, which I then commuted on, and drove back to the State Department. This time, unlike one previous occasion, did not almost run over Henry Kissinger in the basement, thus changing history. Went up to my office, spent the night writing a memo called China in the Year 2000. You can actually find it online now. And then I circulated and was attacked by everybody for being excessively optimistic about Chinese growth, too willing to accept the possibility that China would change in fundamental ways. And in retrospect, my only mistake was I was too pessimistic about what China would accomplish. I underestimated it. And my one fundamental conceptual error was that I imagined in the year 2000 there would still be a Soviet Union. And turned out Kennan was right. If you walled the Soviet Union up enough, it would fail of its own defects. So I tend to be very skeptical about theories that count China out or suggest that it doesn't know what it's doing. I think it does know. I think Xi Jinping does know what he's doing. I don't like a lot of the things he's doing, but they may work.
Clyde, do you want to follow up on that, or
No, I think that was a whole statement.
good?
Neat follow-up.
Well, thank you. I see we have a former salon speaker, Rabbi Shapiro. Yaakov?
Thank you. Thank you.
You're on Long Island, right? You're on
I'm
Long Island?
Queens, New York, right on the border of Long Island. And I must tell you that, John, that introduction, that appreciation of Chas was such a bullseye. And it was only surpassed by Chas's response. Chas, from the first time I met you, the first time I heard you speak in the Metropolitan Club in Washington when I was there, the first thing I did when I got back to New York was to go to Amazon.com and buy a bunch of your books.
Mm.
And I must tell you that you are a incredibly unique individual, eloquence, education, brilliance that separates you from the slower thinking humans that dot this planet. And the more I see your videos and read your books, the more that's confirmed. Every time I hear you, I learn something from you. If only it may be a new word such as embarnacled, or a new phrase such as enemy deficit disorder.
It's also enemy deficit syndrome too. Chas
syndrome,
he does syndrome too.
Or completely new concepts. And I do have a question for you also. This social media phenomenon that you're describing, clearly our founding fathers could not foresee it. My question to you is, do you think that just as the Soviet Union fell apart due to its own intrinsic deficiencies, didn't have the staying power. Do you think that our, dare I say it, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights lacked the prophetic vision to be able to see what challenges a democracy such as this would have in 200 years, and that we have to redo it somehow? Or it's not the democracy or the system that's the challenge, but rather somehow, some way, the people lost their way, or maybe a combination of both.
Well, you were very kind the other day to declare that something I said about the changing world order was rabbinical, which was a great compliment. And I thank you for that, Yaakov. And I would say that the phenomena I described are a direct assault on freedom of speech and liberty of conscience and freedom of assembly. That is to say, they are a return of medieval insistence on conformity. They make dissent into heresy. They demand obeisance to narratives, to beliefs that contradict traditional insights into human nature. And we see now the academy being attacked by students very often to prevent the airing of views that are seen as politically incorrect or that, quote, trigger, unquote, a subjective response on the part of somebody or other. I think this is extraordinarily dangerous. And unless it is corrected, we may indeed have, I think, not a physical civil war, although some are talking about that, but the moral equivalent of a civil war in this country that will end the republic we have been so blessed to have for 245 years. So I think in many ways, I sum all this up by saying that we are looking abroad for monsters to destroy. We are looking abroad as well for scapegoats to blame. But the dangers that we face are primarily internal. And they are driven by a combination of factors that will be very hard to unravel. We made a decision in 1921 about how to finance the media. The first radio broadcast station was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The British and the French and others were wrestling with the same issue. They decided to do public finance of media. We decided to finance media through advertising. That was more or less all right until the 1950s, when the first televised debate between Dwight Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson occurred during the 52 election. And television became the principal medium of communication between our leaders and the people, and between candidates for office and prospective voters. And all of this was done on a commercial basis, with the result that all Congress critters and campaigners have their hands out because they need money to pay the media. This is a recipe for venality, and that is what we have achieved. Somebody elected to Congress has to raise, I believe, at least $30,000 a week to be able to guarantee a chance at re-election, unless he or she is fortunate enough to be in a gerrymandered district. Gerrymandering is another problem. I think the media anticipated the problems that we now have, but they are really the reductio ad absurdum of the trend that began with a questionable decision intended basically to block Marconi, a British company, from dominating our media, which it might otherwise have done. I think we need to rethink a lot of things. And to go back to the question about what my three wishes would be, if I have a fourth wish, it would be that we return to the practice of looking at best practices abroad and considering how to adapt them to our own requirements. Instead of taking the position that we know everything and the foreigners are all ignorant and backward, and there's nothing, as Hillary Clinton said disastrously in response to a comment by Bernie Sanders, there's nothing we can learn from Denmark. I don't believe that. So I hope we will rediscover a measure of humility and curiosity about the world that we seem to lack at present.
Education. You're saying the country needs education.
That's a great part of it. We might return to teaching geography, for example, rather than leaving it to wars to teach us where places are, which is how we learn geography now. We might return to learning history, and not because it repeats itself, but because it's instructive about what might happen, what trends may lead to. We have a population, unfortunately, that in some respects in our schools idolizes Beavis and Butthead and denigrates Einstein. That's not a recipe for a highly competitive response to a very difficult world. And it's not a recipe for preserving our integrity as a country and our prosperity.
Thank you. The valuing of Einstein over Beavis and Butthead certainly has a rabbinical tone to it.
I think
I see.
they were
I see,
somewhere in there, weren't they, in the Old Testament?
Chas, I see. Soroush Shehabi is here tonight. Soroush, can you unmute yourself? I can't see him, but I see he's on.
Well, maybe he's skipped out and just pretending to be on.
No.
Hi, John. How are you?
Hey.
Sorry about the noise. I do want to say something about Chas and the committee. Just give me a second here. I'm out west. My father had a stroke, so I'm tending to him. So I'm in a car, and I pulled over because I wanted to listen to this. But I also wanted to say that I learned so much from the committee and from Chas and everything that he circulates on the listserv. I'm one of your avid readers, and I am a big fan, and I've learned a lot. And I'm curious what your thoughts are, Chas, on what's happening right now in vis-a-vis U.S. policy with Iran and Afghanistan and the Near East. And I know those are big, giant topics that you write a lot about. But do you have any optimism? Are you sanguine in any way? These days, it's hard to be, it seems. And what do you think we can do as Americans to try to steer the ship of state away from forever wars and searching for monsters to destroy?
Well, the questions you mentioned are all the source of the policies are all domestic rather than rational analysis of foreign realities. It's been 41 years since the hostage taking in Tehran, and yet we remain entirely focused on that, overlooking subsequent realities. We are still committed to the policies that that Mike Pompeo called maximum pressure. That maximum pressure has a very good track record of producing results. When we applied it to Japan in 1941 in the summer, it got their attention and they responded at Pearl Harbor. When we applied it to North Korea, they developed a nuclear ICBM with which to strike the United States. When we apply it to Iran, we are giving everyone in Iran who is in favor of a confrontational stance toward us and the West, or in favor of the development of a nuclear weapon, ample excuses to do both. So I don't think this is wise. But we are in a political stasis, rather like the China circumstance I mentioned in response to Clyde's question. We are unable to alter our foreign policy stance because our domestic political gridlock will not permit it. Afghanistan is a classic case of violation of the basic precepts of war. It was entirely justified to enter Afghanistan to bring Al Qaeda and those associated with it to justice, and to chastise the Taliban regime then in power, now again in power, sufficiently to ensure that it would never again offer safe haven to terrorists with global reach. We accomplished that basically within a matter of 4 months. And by January of 2002, with the exception of Osama bin Laden, who slipped over the border into Pakistan, most of Al Qaeda had been killed or captured. The Taliban had been dislodged from power. So we had accomplished our objectives. We then moved the goalposts, which is something you should never do. And very soon it became impossible for anyone to articulate a coherent set of reasons for our continuing in Afghanistan. Every pet rock of every national non-governmental organization, NGO, was being juggled in the air in Afghanistan. There was immense corruption. About a third of the funds we spent on it evaporated somewhere along the line or turned up in Dubai. And there were a lot of people, including the Taliban, who had previously abolished the cultivation of the poppy, who resumed it and made a whole lot of money off narcotics trade. This is a pathetic performance. And in the end, no one could think of a reason for our being there except that being there enabled us to deny that we'd been defeated. Now, if I were an Afghan and I looked at my own history, I'd be rather proud that no foreign invader has ever been able to achieve a permanent foothold in Afghanistan. Not Alexander the Great, not even Genghis Khan, not the British, not us, not the Russians. But that's little solace to Americans. We need to reconsider how we make war. And the beginning of that is to re-entrust the Congress and insist that the Congress debate the reasons for war and define the objectives, and that we then stick with them on the best military advice we can obtain. In the Middle East, there is some good news. As we step back from our dominant position, those in the region who have used our presence and dominance as an excuse have been deprived of that excuse, and they are stepping forward to begin to address their own problems. So you see now an active dialogue across the Persian Gulf between Saudi Arabia and other Gulf Arab states and Iran. You see a re-engagement by these countries with Syria. You see a differentiation in Iraqi policy, which is now less beholden to Iran than it was. You see the beginnings of relationships between Israel and countries in the region that recognize realities. And of course, one of those realities is the strength of the Israel lobby and the desire of the Gulf Arabs to make use of it for their own purposes. But still, this is all very instructive, it seems to me. Now the question is, will we learn from these experiences? So far, there's little evidence that we will. The same people who perpetuated the war in Afghanistan are now on the tube, on television, explaining why they were not responsible for the mess that was created or our defeat, and somebody else was. The Afghans wouldn't fight, for example. Well, 30,000 Afghan troops died fighting the Taliban. This is nonsense. There's nobody in the world better at fighting than the Afghans.
Yes, can I interject on that on Afghanistan? I just wanted to pull back the scope a bit, and I know we focus on what's happened since 9/11, but to pull it back for the last 42 years, going back to Charlie Wilson's war and Brzezinski putting a rag on his head and speaking to a group called the Base in Quetta and declaring jihad for the first time, the Green Crescent versus the Red Crescent, and then allowing, even after 9/11, our partners in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan to spread Wahhabism throughout the schools, notwithstanding the article that was recently circulated about Prince Turki's claim that it was Deobandi and it was somehow different in connecting them to Deobandis in India. But it was fully grafted upon this strict Deobandi vision, which is it's not Sunni Wahhabism, as Terry Ward spoke about. It's its own thing that's less than 300 years old, and we know that it's what Professor Leif Wenner, I believe, of King's College, he keeps the terrorism database. He refers to it as one of the largest ideological campaigns. His number is 10 billion that was spent during that time period, and yet we never told them to stop. And so this nation-building project of the Saudis and the Pakistanis, which really involved erasing the pre-existing culture in a large degree, has gone on. And Terry tells me it's spreading to Indonesia. We know it went to Syria. We know it's in Africa, Boko Haram. It's metastasized throughout, and with 98% of acts of terror, Islamic terror, quote unquote, where deaths involved, according to Professor Wenner, in the West, are related to Wahhabism, and 94% worldwide. Those are since 2001, so very, very stark numbers. And so I wonder, with your experience with Saudi Arabia and that part of the world, why haven't we, told them to cut it out, to stop it? Since we see, we see how it's spread and impacted so much of, and let me just for balance say, this is not to say the Islamic Republic of Iran is any great shakes either, but I do see, the data as being deeply troubling, and this, is continuing seemingly to take over larger swaths of the Middle East.
No, I have a different view of this than Terry or you. I think the fundamental problem, yes, there in the 18th century in Saudi Arabia and later in India, there were puritanical reform movements, Protestant movements within Islam that basically argued that they should go back to, the believers should go back to what were imagined to be the original practices of Islam. In many cases, rather spurious vision of those original practices. But I think the fundamental problem is something I call post-colonial stress disorder. And that is to say, much of the world over the last 500 years was traumatized, humiliated by the West, by imperial powers. And everywhere in the areas that were colonized, which does not include Saudi Arabia, by the way, which was never colonized, the only place on earth that wasn't. Everywhere one sees politics organized around a reaction to this experience of humiliation. I think that explains the 79-80 Islamic Revolution in Iran. I think it explains the trend in Indonesia, which has traditionally been a very tolerant place, toward more extremist views. I think it explains Hindutva in India, and explains the century of humiliation grievances of the Chinese, and so forth and so on. And so this is fertile ground for extremist views. Now, if you firmly believe in your own religious convictions, which we all should, the history of Judeo-Christian Islamic religious tradition is that Jews now don't proselytize, but they used to, and the Christian and Islamic faiths both place a duty on believers to proselytize, and you do so with views that maybe reflect traditional values in a backward society like Saudi Arabia before the discovery of oil, or India under the Raj. And the fertile ground is there for this to grow into something quite nasty, which it has done. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, there's been a dramatic mellowing under Mohammed bin Salman. People may condemn him for his character or lack of morality in some areas, but they can't deny that he has brought about major change in Saudi society, including the retraction of support for religious reactionaries. So I'd argue that it's far more complicated than that, and that one can't simply scapegoat Deobandis or so-called Wahhabis. Wahhabi is obviously, as you know, a term of opprobrium. It's a little bit like calling somebody from Texas a Christer. It would not be appreciated. And it's not very illuminating. So I think this is a discussion we need to have. We can't have it in the United States because we all know exactly everything that we need to know already. So if you voice an opinion on this that's at odds with the demonization of Islam, you're pilloried, which goes back to my statement that I think one of our fundamental problems is the atomization of American society as part of deliberate business plans to achieve that.
So let's have a little discussion about economics. I see Antoine von Achmel, former, I think, Antoine, you've been a speaker twice over the years, and Paul Horn and Warren Coates jump in here. But Antoine, there you go. There you go. Yeah,
Okay.
we hear you now.
You started asking me a question, but I didn't know what the question was.
I just wanted, I saw that you were here, celebrate Chaz's, our award to Chaz. And I said we had a discussion about a number of subjects, but we haven't gotten into anything in economics. We've had 2 salons with you, with Paul Horn and Warren Coates may want to jump in. But do you have any a question for Chaz, Antoine, or anything to say?
Chess, and this is something we discussed over coffee some time ago. The question that I have is fundamentally, we have gotten used now for some time to being number one. And we are moving into a position of no longer being number one. Whether that's in economics or in other areas, but certainly in economics, at some point that's going to happen, but it's going to happen in many other areas. And that is a change in the mindset. And so I wonder what you, given your vast experience and having gone through various different periods of American diplomacy, what would, in your view, be a way for us to adjust to that reality, or at least what I think will be a reality?
I don't think we have any choice. We will have to adjust.
Yeah, no, but how do we do it?
Yeah, well, in 1870 or so, we became the largest economy in the world, measured through GDP. Measured that way, we still are. Notably, however, China is now twice as large an industrial economy as the United States. Maybe if we are engaged in a contest with China that can be won by a game between insurance brokers and financiers, we will win hands down because we have more of both. If we're in a contest to make things, or maybe even to innovate, we are going to be in trouble because we have historically imported brains. Our educational system does not supply the market with the scientific and technological, engineering and mathematical talent that it needs. So we import people. And around a third of our Nobel Prize winners are foreign born. And if you go into an AI lab and anywhere in a major university in the United States, you'll find 60% of the people there are foreign born. We are now doing everything possible to discourage people from staying here rather than encourage them to stay. We became great because we were open to foreigners and their ideas, and because we had the necessary humility to think that we might learn from them. What we have to do is overcome our complacency, recognize that we are slipping back, and that the answer to restoring momentum and regaining leadership lies in resuming a decent respect for the opinions of mankind and the progress that is being made elsewhere. There are plenty of smart people in the United States. We have a fantastic array of human types. This should be our greatest advantage, but it can only be so if we're open to collaboration with foreigners, and increasingly we're closed on national security grounds. There's a saying in Chinese which criticized the earlier period when China was self-isolated, that you can't you can't close the door and manufacture a cart by yourself. It requires teamwork and it requires collaboration with others. And we need to rediscover that. There's a sort of misplaced hubris which assumes that any technology anyone else has must have been stolen from us rather than invented by them. And we're hearing the same thing said about the Chinese that we heard about the Japanese earlier. You know, they copy, but they can't innovate. Well, I think there's been conclusive proof that's not the case. So I think we need to be a little more humble, be a little more curious, be a little more adaptable, and be more welcoming. And that is the only way in which we can make it through this transition. And we have everything going for us if we have decent policies.
Travis, I see you. Travis said he had to go and he had a quick question here. Travis? Travis, you get the award for having the best background.
Thank
tell
you.
what
These are early Cypress wooden doors from a mud fort in Jebel, and I thought it was appropriate for us to sit in front of them for Chas.
I'm trying to read.
They're virtual on this, but they in fact live downstairs in our cabinet of curiosities. Chas, you know, one of the intimidating aspects of being in this company is that somebody has to be in the lower half of expertise and ability in the audience, and so I speak on behalf of us. Chas, 3 points and one question. The award is well deserved, but award or no award, you're remarkable in my experience for many things, but let me single out or triple out 3 of them. You combine an intellectual clarity and toughness with personal charm, humility, and kindness in what's just a rare combination. That's remarkable. Second, you combine sobriety, and the world calls for sobriety, with wit, and the world calls for wit. But those two molecules are rarely found in the same compound. So I applaud and thank you for that. And then lastly, I just think it's important that the records show that you may know 10,000 Chinese characters, but I believe you're mastering
11,000.
How many?
Well, Chaz says there are 13,000. He learned 11,000 initially.
I stand corrected. But the point is comparative. I believe your Chinese cooking includes more recipes than characters. So even that, even even that is impressive. So let me move to the question. I want to know why I am so fortunate to know you, and how has this been achieved in an era when almost everything else has gone wrong? And I'm going to take my answer offline. Thank you, my good friend.
Well, Travis, with the exception of your admiration for me, you clearly belong in the upper tier. And you just demonstrated it. And there's a very simple answer to how I got to know you, namely, I admire your wife, which I think you do too. So we have something in common.
We share that view. We share that view.
Yes. And,
including my wife, that makes 3 of us.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
John?
Good. Warren. Good,
John?
Warren, Coach. Yeah.
I will more clearly occupy the lower half, but I am honored to be in this company. I'm honored to be in your company. I learn every time I listen to you, as well as from many others of you in this room. And I certainly share all of the high praise that has been directed to you this evening. But in the spirit of dialogue and debate, I want to take some exception to the importance you have given to social media.
Mm.
There are issues there, challenges there, where we need to tweak things a bit, etc. But I am much more concerned and give much more importance to not education in the pedantic sense, but to what is being taught and what is being absorbed by today's younger class of citizens, the counterculture that is absolutely the opposite of our beliefs in free speech, open debate, confrontation of views, etc. And I, in my mind, sometime back, tended to associate this a bit with the helicopter moms who overprotected their children, who grew up not being used to confronting contrary views or adversity, etc. They always wanted to be protected. And that's what I'm hearing from the universities today of, don't you dare say something that might be offensive to me. And I think that's a bigger challenge than Facebook.
Well, I think that's a very valid comment. I don't see the two as entirely separate. I have noted with some horror that in our schools, kids are taught that they are the best because no one wants to hurt their feelings. I remember, and this is a cultural comment, when I came back to the United States from the Bahamas, I had studied in a British school where there was caning and other disciplinary practices, and there was strong competition to be the best. I went to a very prestigious preparatory school in Massachusetts, and I had a run-in immediately with the Latin teacher because I could read Latin almost as well as English. I had no idea how to decline nouns or conjugate verbs. I'd actually studied it as a language instead of a grammatical exercise. So when I did a sight translation of something, the Latin teacher accused me of cheating. somehow, although it wasn't apparent how I might have, and asked me a question. Do you think you're better than everyone else? And I paused, because the answer in my previous book would have been, I'm trying to be. And the answer in Massachusetts was, no, sir. And that, to me, is a tragic feature of our educational system. It levels down rather than promotes up. I don't think we teach civics anymore on any reasonable basis. I know we don't teach much about foreign affairs. We are illiterate about diplomacy, which became my proto-profession. We don't know. Nobody knows that we didn't become independent until the British signed the Treaty of Paris with us. Nobody knows that the Louisiana Purchase came to us not by conquest, but by diplomacy, and so forth and so on. We don't understand that function, and we don't understand our own history, still less that of others. And as I said earlier, we have a cult of mediocrity that is very injurious. So I think this comes together, that is particularly the we don't want to hurt your poor little ego approach to education, comes together with this idea of trigger words and microaggressions and other things, which essentially are the imposition of subjective standards on objective circumstances. If I say something that's politically correct, well, it goes back to Bishop Berkeley's question: if the tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, did it happen? And my question to my wife has always been: if a man makes a mistake in the forest and there's no woman there to observe it, is he still wrong? I think it is important for us to restore a measure of objectivity, which I gather is what you're arguing for, Warren. And I will end by saying that if you learn something from me, I can't tell you how many things I've learned from you. So I thank you for that.
Good. We've got there were a few other people that wanted. I think Michael Hudner, you had I just saw your chat thing. You had a question or comment.
It's a quick story about statecraft that I learned from Chas. My late wife, his sister Hope, and I were having Thanksgiving in the King Khalid Game Preserve in 1991 when Chas was ambassador. And one of the guests was the Mexican ambassador to Saudi Arabia, who had been invited out to see the troops during the desert shield buildup in the desert. And he accepted the offer from Chas and said, yes, he'd like to go and see his army, which was pretty funny because they were all Hispanic Americans. And then my wife, Hope, said, oh, well, Chas must have enjoyed speaking Spanish to you. And he looked at her and his jaw dropped and he said, does Chas speak Spanish? So a little statecraft. Chas, what an evening. Congratulations to you. And my thanks to John and the committee for this great tribute to you. Well deserved. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah.
It is true that for a year and a half, King Fahd did not know that I was eavesdropping on all his consultations with his staff during our meetings, until one day he asked me a question. I made a mistake of answering directly rather than waiting for the interpreter. It is playing dumb is a good idea if you can get away with it.
Good. So I see Hedrick Smith has joined us. Hedrick, do you want to say something before we sign off?
Just amazement at the staggering range of experience and wisdom that Chas brings to so many different discussions of so many different topics. Many of us specialize in one thing, another, one area or another, Saudi Arabia or China or Latin America or whatever. And Chas covers the waterfront. It's amazing. And as somebody who's tried a few waterfronts, I take my hat off to you, especially high, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Chaz, one of your partners said that it's like having 3 or 4 partners. Just having you, you'd have a partner for China, a partner for the Arabs. You know, you're all this. You know, you're many partners all rolled up in one.
Well, thank you, Hedrick. Coming from you, that's a real compliment. I know you've swum off a lot of waterfronts and with great dispatch, and you're still here, so that's great. And as for me, despite this celebration of my life, for which I thank you again, John and Boyden and the committee, I'm not planning to check out anytime soon. So I hope to continue to play a role behind the scenes as the new management of the committee proceeds.
Right, coming attractions. Thank you, Chaz. I want to have everyone that we should applaud Chaz on what's been a fabulous run, and we'll keep it going.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chaz.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank
Thank you.
Wonderful, Chaz.
Fantastic.
Yes, thank you
Night,
so
Chaz.
much.
Congratulations, Chaz.
Going strong.
Thanks,
Chaz.
Chaz.
Congratulations, Chaz.
Thank you, Chas.
Congratulations, Poppy.